Hi, Algebra students. This is Ms. Carranza, and today we are going to talk about Lesson 8.6. The quadratic formula. Some of you may have already studied this formula before, so today will be a review, and if you've never learned this before, don't worry, I'll do my best to explain it so that it becomes easy peasy to use. The quadratic formula, as you can tell by the name, is used to solve quadratics. So anytime you're given an equation, so when you see an equal sign on the problem and the highest exponent is a squared or a quadratic, you are allowed to use the quadratic formula. Now, the quadratic formula works best as long as your quadratic is set equal to 0, okay? And more specifically, when it is in standard form. If you look back at Lesson 8.5, we talked about vertex form in Lesson 8.5 Day 2. Standard form looks like this. Okay? Remember, I always like to draw little smiley faces on my 0, but if you don't feel like it, you can just put 0. Now, in standard form, the coefficients of the quadratic, the linear term, and the constant term are used in the quadratic formula. So take a minute and look at the formula and notice that A, B, and C, which are the coefficients in standard form, all appear in the formula. The A and the B appear twice, and the C appears once. Now, if you're reading the formula, it looks like it says x equals negative b. We are going to call it opposite of b instead of negative b, okay? Because it could be a little bit deceiving. Some people think then this is always going to be negative. But that's not true. Whatever I give you for b, you're going to take the opposite of it in front of here, okay? Inside the parentheses, inside the square root, you're going to use your normal b. Now, someone a long time ago taught me a song to help me memorize the quadratic formula, and you're welcome to learn it too if you want. It goes to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. And this is how it goes. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So I'm going to sing it one more time, and unfortunately some of you are going to go a little crazy from listening to me singing it for these notes, but it does help you memorize it. And yes, you will use this formula in other math classes in the future. So it goes, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Okay. I highly recommend that you guys memorize this formula because it'll just make your life easier for this section and for other classes. All right, let's take a look at the directions. Some of you have not been reading the directions when you take your quizzes and do your homework. Always read the directions because sometimes I'm very specific about what strategy I want you to use. For example, some of you were solving using factoring when I wanted you to use SADMAP or inverse operations. Here, I specifically want you to use the quadratic formula. Okay, so go ahead and take a minute, write down example number 1 and the directions. Pause the video and push play when you are ready. Okay, as I look at example 1, the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to notice that I've been given something that's already in standard form and already set equal to 0. Great. That means it should be very easy for me to identify the A, the B, and the C. So the A is going to be the term that is the coefficient for the quadratic. B is the term that is the coefficient for the linear term. And C is the constant term. So I'm going to go ahead and write those numbers off to the side, A, B, and C. A is positive 3, B is positive 5, and C is positive 1. Now I'm going to go ahead and set up my quadratic formula. Feel free to sing along. x equals the opposite of b. So since my b is positive 5, I'm going to use the opposite, which is negative 5. Plus or minus the square root, make it nice and long, of b squared minus 4ac. I'm going to go ahead and put parentheses and go ahead and fill in the numbers of b squared minus 4ac. And here you're using regular b, so positive 5, minus 4 times a, which is positive 3, and c, which is 1, all divided by 2a. Now in the quadratic formula, when you see minus 4ac, remember that those are all being multiplied, so that's all multiplication, and then in the denominator, the bottom of the fraction, that's also multiplication. Okay, so again, we use the quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. This formula might seem very, very complicated, so we are going to do it in steps. The part of the song that says b squared minus 4ac, which is inside the square root, that's what we're going to simplify first and put in our calculator. Okay? So the first thing we're going to do, it's called the discriminant, is we're going to put just the 5 squared minus 4ac. B squared minus 4ac without the square root. Okay, so pause the video, go ahead and put that in your calculator, or you can do it in your head, and tell me what you get as your answer. When you're ready, I also want you to figure out what the answer is for the denominator, the bottom part of the fraction. So the second thing you're going to do is the denominator. Okay? All right, what did you guys get as your answers? You should have gotten 13 and 6. So now I'm going to put those back into the equation. So I'm going to copy and bring down the negative 5, the opposite of b. I'm going to put my square root and the fraction so I can put the denominator. I'm going to put the 13 inside the root and the 6 in the denominator because that's what I got when I simplified. Now there are two answers here, so you're going to have to be really careful how you put this in your calculator and how you keep going with the problem. Do you see the plus or minus? Plus or minus is very important because that shows you that there are two answers. So there's a negative 5 plus square root of 13 over 6 and negative 5 minus square root of 13 over 6. Depending on what calculator you have, you need to make sure that you do the top part of the fraction first. So some of you are going to have to use parentheses. So we need to find 5 plus the square root of 13, put it in parentheses, and then divide by 6. Be careful because some calculators have an extra set of parentheses here, and so you're going to have to close it off. I'll show you what I mean by that. So some of you have calculators that already put parentheses inside the root, so you're going to have to close that one and put another one before you divide by 6. If you have the calculator that allows you to put fractions with this button over here, the little squares that are above each other, use that instead. Okay? So put negative 5 plus square root of 13 on the top and then 6 on the bottom. Okay, you should get an answer of approximately negative 0.23. If you didn't get that answer, it's possibly because you typed it wrong. If you're having trouble with knowing where to put your parentheses, then my suggestion is to put the top part of the fraction in your calculator, push equals, so negative 5 plus square root of 13 equals, and then divide that answer by 6. So put negative 5 plus square root of 13 equals, then push divide by 6 equals. for this next one, I'm going to do negative 5 minus square root of 13 divided by 6. So some of you will just have to put those two parentheses. If your calculator automatically puts parentheses inside of your root, well, you're going to have to close those parentheses and then put an extra one at the end outside of the parentheses. So again, this parentheses that I have right here has to be outside of the root. So you might have to use your arrow to get out of the root and then close it. So, okay. All right, give it a try. And your answer should be negative 1.43. So those are our two solutions for this quadratic. If you need help with your calculator or have any questions, don't forget that you can send me a message through Remind or an email. Okay. As I look at example 2, I notice that it is not set equal to 0 and it is not in standard form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my quadratic terms. There's only a quadratic term on the left side. It's already positive, so that means I want all the other terms to be on that same side, the left side. Very carefully, I'm going to start moving all the terms to the left side, making sure that I keep like terms together. So the negative 2x, I'm going to cancel with a positive 2x, combine it with the 7x, that will give me 9x. I'm going to bring down the negative 12. I'm going to cancel the negative 12 with a positive 12. And I'm going to finally have a 0, which is what you need when you're solving using the quadratic formula. You need to make sure that your quadratic is set equal to 0 and that it is in standard form. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and label all my coefficients. So A is the coefficient of my quadratic term. B is the coefficient of my linear term. And C is the coefficient at the end. I'm going to take a minute and put all of those coefficients off to the right. This is optional. You do not have to do this if you don't want to. You can just label them the way I have written here. Okay, now I'm ready to substitute all those numbers into the quadratic formula. So here we go. X equals the opposite of b. So since my b was positive 9, I'm going to use the opposite, which is negative 9. Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So notice that I always put the regular b, which was 9, in parentheses. I recommend that you always put, anytime you have an exponent of 2 or 3 or whatever, make sure you're using parentheses, because that'll help you for whenever your number is negative inside. Okay, b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Do you remember what we simplified first? First, you want to go ahead and simplify the b squared minus 4ac without the square root. So without the square root, I'm going to just type this into my calculator, and I'm also going to do the denominator. So I'm going to do that second. Okay, go ahead and simplify those, and then tell me what you get. Okay, if you got 17 and 2, you did it right. So now I'm going to bring down my x equals. I'm going to bring down my opposite of b plus or minus the square root. And I'm going to write the whole thing over a fraction of 2. And inside the root, I'm going to put the 17. So those are the answers that I got previously. I just put them there. Okay? Okay. Do you remember what to do next? There are two solutions here. So I'm going to go ahead and split this up into negative 9 plus square root of 17 divided by 2 and negative 9 minus square root of 17 divided by 2. Remember that in your calculator you need to figure out the answer to the top part first and then divide by 2. Remember that parentheses are very important. And for this one I'm going to do negative 9 minus square root of 17 first and then divide by 2. Remember that I use these squiggly equal signs because I'm rounding. The answer doesn't come out perfect, so give it a go, put them in your calculator, and then check your answer when you're ready. If you're not getting these answers, it is super important for you to keep trying until you do get them right. So it has to do with the parentheses. Again, remember that some calculators put parentheses inside of the root, so you have to close those parentheses and then use your arrow to get out of the root and put another parenthesis outside of the root. Okay? That's usually for most of the Texas Instrument ones, but the Casios, remember, you can just use your fraction button with the little squares that are above each other. Remember that you can pause the video at any time and rewind it to see any examples over again. Okay, go ahead and write down example 3. You should notice that it's not set equal to 0. So I'm going to look for my quadratic term. If I had quadratic terms on both sides, I would move them all to the side wherever the bigger quadratic term was. We always move the smaller quadratic. So since this is the only quadratic and it's on the right side, I'm going to start moving all the terms from the left side to the right side and keeping like terms. So do you notice that the right side has a quadratic term and a constant term but no linear term? So that means that right there is where the x is going to go. It doesn't have a like term on the right side, so we have to make space for it, because it cannot combine with the 5x squared or the 8. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and cancel the negative 2 with a positive 2 until I get a 0. Okay, so now I've got my coefficients. A is 5, B is 1, and C is 10. Five, 1, and 10. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start filling them into the quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all divided by 2A. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to simplify the discriminant, which is the part inside of the square root. It's the B squared minus 4AC and the bottom part, all divided by 2A. So we're going to do the 2A and the B squared minus 4AC, and once we have those answers, we're going to fill them in. So pause the video, put those in your calculator. So you're doing B squared minus 4AC, and you're doing 2A. Did you get a crazy answer for B squared minus 4AC? Yeah, I got negative 199. That's okay. And then here I got 10. So I'm going to fill them in. Now, if you remember from previous lessons, we said when you square root a positive, you get 2 solutions. So all the previous numbers, if you remember, in example 1, we square rooted 13. That's a positive number, so we had 2 answers. In number 2, we square rooted 17, so we had 2 answers because 17 is positive. But here, since we're square rooting a negative, That means there is no real solution. If you don't believe me, put it in your calculator, and your calculator will freak out and say, can't do it. Whenever you square root a negative, you're going to get no real solution. We talked about that in lesson 8.5, day 2. Okay, when you're ready, go ahead and write down example 4. If you notice, it is not set equal to 0, so take a minute or two to move all the terms to the appropriate side so that all your quadratics are together and your leading coefficient is positive. So pause the video right now. I want you to copy down example 4 and move everything, all the terms, to one side. Okay, hopefully you didn't cheat. And I hope that you paused the video and actually tried to do example 4 by yourself. Now, this problem can actually be factored. This problem can be factored if you multiply 9 times 4 is 36, and if you find two numbers that add to negative 12 are negative 6 and negative 6. So this problem can be factored, but that's not what the directions asked us to do. They asked us to solve by using the quadratic formula. Now, if you guys on a test see a problem like this and it can be factored, you can factor it. But if you want to use the quadratic formula, you can. Okay, first things first, label your coefficients. Notice that the b is negative. In the previous problems, the b was always positive, but it doesn't have to be. I'm going to write my coefficients off to the side. You don't have to do this if you've already labeled them carefully. Remember that a subtraction in front of a number means that that number is negative. Some of you guys have struggled with that all year long. All right, now I'm going to substitute those values. X equals the opposite of b. So since my b is negative, I'm going to use the opposite of that, which is positive. Plus or minus the square root, make it nice and big, of b squared minus 4ac. So first I put the parentheses, then I fill in my values. Remember that in the formula, outside of the square root, it's opposite of b. Inside the square root, it's regular b. b squared minus 4ac. Make sure you're using parentheses before you square it. All divided by 2a. Okay, so now we're going to do the discriminant, which is the b squared minus 4ac, and the denominator. So first, b squared minus 4ac. Looks like it's a 72. Second, you're going to do the denominator, the bottom part of the fraction. Okay, take a minute, figure those out. When I have my answers, I'm going to go ahead and replace them into my formula, my quadratic formula. You should have gotten 0 and 18. Now, when you square root 0, what does that mean? That means that you only have one answer. That is a review of lesson 8.5 when we were solving using SADMAP. 0 is the only number that there isn't a plus and a minus of. You can have a positive and negative 2, positive and negative 3, positive and negative 2.57, but you can't have a positive and a negative 0. And if you don't believe me, you can try it. Do 12 plus 0 divided by 18. Then do 12 minus 0 divided by 18. You're going to get the same answer. Now, if you're wondering where I got 2/3, my calculator said 0.66666 repeating. That is an exact fraction. So you're going to need to, anytime you see a repeating decimal, it means that that number can be written as a fraction. So you just need to convert it to a fraction. So some of you have to push your second ABC button. Some of you with your graphing calculators have to push math, enter, enter. But the answer is 2/3, or 0.666 repeating. Again, if you get a repeating decimal, make sure you don't round it. Make sure that you write it as an exact fraction. When you're ready, go ahead and copy example 5. Notice that it's not set equal to 0, so go ahead and do that. Pause the video and push play when you're ready. Okay, I decided to move everything to the left side because that's where the quadratic was positive. If there had been quadratics on both sides, I would have moved the smaller one. So the first thing I did is I canceled the positive 5x by subtracting 5x with the like term on the left, and they ended up canceling on both sides, so there were no more linear terms. Then the 18 was positive, I subtracted it, so I can't subtract 18 from the 3x squared because they're not like terms, so I kept them separate. This one, since it has no linear term, can actually be solved using inverse operations. So I'm going to show you that this could be solved using inverse operations, aka SADMEP. Cancel addition and subtraction, then multiplication or division, square root both sides, and you get plus or minus 2.45. But you can get those same answers by using the quadratic formula, which is what they wanted me to do here. Okay, now notice that we have a quadratic term, so that's A, but we're missing the linear term. So B is missing. What would it be if it's missing? So here's the constant term, negative 18. We've got a quadratic term, we're missing the linear term, and we have a constant term of negative 18. What do you think we should put then if it's missing? If you said 0, you are correct. Okay, here's my formula. Quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of B. Guess what? There's no such thing as opposite 0, so I'm just going to go ahead and put 0. Plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, all divided by 2A. Go ahead and simplify the numbers inside of the square root. Make sure that you're not actually putting the square root into your calculator when you're doing this. So don't put the square root, just put 0 squared minus 4AC, 4 times 3 times negative 18. You should get an answer of 216. And then for the numbers inside of the root, and then 6. Okay, so now, because I'm square rooting a positive, I'm going to have two answers. 0 plus the square root of 216, then divided by the denominator, which is 6, and then 0 minus square root of 216, and divided by 6. Go ahead and put those in your calculator, and you'll see that one answer is positive 245, and the other one is negative 2.45, which are the same exact answers that I got when I used SADMEP. Alright guys, if you have any questions, don't forget that you can send me a message on Remind or email me, and I'll be happy to help you or do more examples with you. Have a good day.